Good morning. Good morning to all of you. A warm welcome to the Holland International Distribution Council update on logistics real estate. We organized this event in partnership with Jones Lang LaSalle. My name is Jan-Paul Olieslager, and at HIDC, I am responsible for the business development for East Coast United States and Canada. During today's webinar, Sven Bertens and Guy Gerard, who is joining us from Marseille, will update us on the latest developments in the logistics real estate market. Subjects such as demand and design of real estate, digitalization and decarbonization will be discussed. We would like to end the webinar with a short Q&A session, so please do not hesitate to ask your questions in the chat. That's all from my side. I would like to give the floor to Sven Bertens, Head of Research and Strategy at Jones Lang LaSalle Netherlands.
And unmute. Okay. Good morning to you all. Afternoon already, just a minute ago. Yeah, thanks for inviting us to give you guys an update on the logistics real estate market. So my part as head of research here in the Netherlands is to give you some insights in the Dutch characteristics of the market, what happened over the last few years in terms of supply and demand. To give you a bit of context, what is happening here in the Netherlands in a European perspective. So all in all, Europe performed very well in terms of logistics. It has been already for over a decade. We've seen take-up numbers going up due to drivers that my colleague Guy will further give some insights on later in this presentation. But in 2021, the market almost exploded. And it was definitely the case in the Netherlands, as you can see here on this slide. Compared to other markets, in relative to 2020, the market in terms of take-up almost doubled in the Netherlands. So we're coming from a base from 2020 about 2.5 million square meters of take-up, and that increased in last year to 4.5 million square meters, almost 5 million square meters. So that's enormous, and that space wasn't just available in the market just in terms of vacancy. So that's something that we'll discuss in the next few slides as well. So what we can see here is how that long-term trend in the Netherlands has evolved. To be honest, we try to forecast take-up numbers at the beginning of the year, but this was definitely not something that we forecasted for 2021. We've seen a lot of large transactions that took place, predominantly new builds, build-to-suits that we've seen taking place. The trend of the bigger the better did increase. Transactions of Lida, Vida XL, DSV, just a handful of examples that took place, which all leased over 50, 60, even 100,000 square meters. And that has become over the last few years quite common. So we are definitely seeing like the dotted lines here of the last 5 to 10 years that the averages are increasing, and maybe that's something to expect for the next 5 years as well. What we are seeing in terms of take-up, and there's a lot of discussion, of course, in the Netherlands in terms of should we still be developing for logistics, given the land scarcity, the boxification of the landscape. But if you look at where demand is coming from and what the occupier of the space is looking for, the majority of that space that they've leased over 2021 has been newly built space. So on the right-hand side of this graph, you can see that it's either newly developed, recently completed, or recently completed space. That's 70% of all the take-up. And the existing space, the other 30%, most of that take-up, as on the left-hand side of this graph, that's high quality space. So occupiers are looking for a modern big box warehouse in the major hubs across the Netherlands, and that's not about to change. So there is a big pressure on vacancy and disbalance between supply and demand, which will probably continue if land scarcity will increase. In terms of vacancy, slightly further elaboration on that. So in terms of the European-wide trend, as we've seen in take-up numbers, vacancy is decreasing already since 2011, reached in European perspective at the lowest point just below the 4% mark. As you can see here on this map, a lot of the West European hubs have vacancy rates far below that. As you can see, for example, London, German cities, Antwerp, all lower vacancy rates. Even in the Netherlands, that's the case. In the Netherlands, we register all qualities, all types of space, all qualities. So also the less qualitative space that we take into account into our numbers. And even then, vacancy in Amsterdam, it's 1.5%. And that's just below the national figure of slightly below the 2% mark. And that's telling us something about how the disbalance between supply and demand, like I just referred to, is playing out, and is of course different by region. But in general, for the whole of the Netherlands, it can be said that there's much more demand for locations than there is supply. And coming back to the composition of take-up, that's the reason, of course, why a lot of the transactions have been taking place in newly built space which is already under construction, or future build-to-suit solutions for occupiers who are already signing for future developments. If you then look at, again, to emphasize a bit on the balance between supply and demand in several countries, just to pick out the Netherlands, of course, for this session. So what you do see here is the years, the balance in years between supply and demand. So how many years does it take to really absorb supply in the market based on a average take-up over the last 12 months? So that's of course a theoretical figure, but it says something about how much pressure there is on rent levels as well. So what it says here, that the 0.35 for the Netherlands is that it's only have 0.3 years, so less than 4 months of space available to accommodate demand in the market. So the market is extremely tight and is pushing up rents, has been already pushing up rents over the last few years. This is again the European perspective. And our forecast for the next 4 to 5 years is even more aggressive than it was over the past 5 years. It's also to do with rising construction prices, of course, but the characteristics of the market, the balance between supply and demand, it's historic at the moment. So it's really pushing up the rent levels. As you can see here, the majority of the markets across Europe already saw rents increasing. Rotterdam came from a base of around 65, 67. A year ago, it's now around 72, 73. Also the southern markets like Tilburg, Venlo, Breda, Roosendaal, they are all seeing strong rental increases, and it's just starting to play out. And there's much more to expect from that side for the occupiers. The next few slides I'll hand over to my colleague Guy, who will take you through the drivers behind demand.
Hey Sven, thank you. Good morning, everybody. My name is Guy. Some of you, and I've seen the participant list, know me. I lead logistics in Europe for JLL, and I also look after the business development activity of JLL for occupiers globally. I've only been working in property for the past 7 years. I spent the 25 years before these 7 in the supply chain industry, leading different business development teams across the world. So what you're going to see now is an extract of one of our survey, and we have that comprehensive survey available if you some of you request that. And we're looking at demand, and that's based on the research on over 800 people from GLL across the world, and about 50 of our customers, whether they are occupiers or landlords across the world. You know, I guess this first slide that Sven is showing us doesn't surprise you. The main driver for space is e-com, and that's a very strong tailwind that we experience in our business, in the logistics property, and it's the same whether you are in the US or whether you are in Europe or APAC. E-com is, as some of you will know, requires a lot more space than the historical standard building that are fulfilling orders that go into shops. When you are picking by item, of course, you need a lot more space. One thing that is worth mentioning on the sustainability front and on the ESG front is that when you look at the end-to-end emissions, e-com, and it's not only us saying it, but different people conclude that it's not really generating a lot more emissions than traditional retail. In fact, it's lower by just over 1/3. Okay, and the other thing to note on e-com is the importance of returns, and you know, that's a main driver for space need. Sven, we can go on to the next one if that's okay. We have 2 or 3 slides illustrating what are the main drivers for more space. It's, you know, the phrase that has been used recently is inventory just in case. And, you know, when you have difficulties, whether they are geopolitically generated, as we can see on the left side, or whether they are operationally generated. I was listening to Soren Skog from Maersk and earlier last week, I think, and there are about 90 ships outside LA Long Beach, and there's a queue for about 4 weeks because they can't get enough drivers, they can't get enough crane or crane drivers to offload containers of ships. So these are an illustration of what is increasing need for space. Sven, you can move on. Then what you also have a new driver that is referenced here is people are reshoring, and there's a couple of fashion examples here. It seems to be a big trend in the fashion industry. We also have Benetton as another firm. So we see more and more needs for space around the Med and in Eastern Europe. So that's what we're trying to illustrate here. We go with that one. And then we try to ask our population at GLL and our clients, what is going to happen in terms of demand going forward? And we've classified under 5 different types of boxes. You can read the details, but what I will say is that globally it's the large, it's not the very large, but in America it's rather large. It's 100,000 square meter. The mega box, which are over 100,000 square meter, are not that many. And for some of you on the call today who have got an operational background, you can really remember and imagine the headaches and the nightmares that these mega box will generate. So what is to note is that in Europe, one of the key drivers is small space, and you saw the appetite for small space. I don't know if you follow the property market, but Mileway, which is backed by Blackstone and is a platform of small property assets around Europe, they have assembled over the past 3 years 15 million square meter of small space. They refinanced at like 21 billion US. So that shows you the appetite that there is from investors, that is derived from the occupier need for this type of space. So that's something very important to note. You can move on, Sven. Thank you. What you will see here is what Sven said for Netherlands is that the land constraint is true everywhere. Okay, it's a bit more relevant in some geographies than others, but there is a general lack of available land that is available for speculative building. What you need to do nowadays to get land unlocked is you need to go and engage with the local authorities with a project, and you can explain how many jobs you will get per square meter. That's really the KPI that people look at. And the other thing you can look at is how much will you invest? And we will come back to that later. You can move on, Sven. The automation is a big driver. What you see here on this slide is that there is a strong growth in e-com, as we mentioned before, and last mile. So in a way, it's a recap of the previous slides. And there is also a strong increase in inventory. And I was referencing the just in case, but there is also a regionalization of manufacturing. And you could see that really in the US, and I think we talked to that point later. Mexico is really benefiting from the, call it, geopolitical tension in between China and the US over the past 6 years or so, that were started by the Trump administration. We good with this slide. Thank you, Sven. So we decided to classify things around 4 Ds. There were the 4 Ps. Now we have invented the 4 Ds around demand, decarbonization, digitization, and design. Europe is showing the lead, and I was talking to one of the largest global owner of industrial logistics property, and they say that really it's Europe that is driving their change and their innovation in this field in the US as well. Smart technology, Internet of Things, a lot of automation. We see a lot of automation in the new fulfillment centers, and there are more and more fulfillment centers coming on stream, directly for e-com players or also for 3PLs or logistics service providers. That covers item 2, item 3. That's roughly the same, but it also impacts trucks. And one of the key areas is, that I forgot to mention there on the sustainability is the energy efficiency. That's the key to what we see happening on the ESG front. Thank you, Sven. So a bit more on decarbonization with the stats that were picked up from the survey of our people. And you see that Europe is leading, with a 40% mark. And what you also find, and I'll give you a few anecdotes beyond the slides, is that some investors will not invest in buildings that are carbon neutral anymore. Some investors will not even have tenants that don't have a proper ESG policy, which is another thing that is new, and we found out in 2021. And in fact, some logistics service providers and their principals or their clients are now ready to pay a premium for a more sustainable building in the broad sense. You can move on, Sven, thank you. What you see is that, as very often, Northern Europe and Northern and Western Europe are the leaders in terms of sustainability, taking actions. There are some areas like Asia or the US that are moving slower, but they are moving. The US is still not right up on the agenda, but it's they are getting there very slowly. Thank you, Sven. And the energy, as I mentioned earlier, is the number one priority in this context. Carbon emissions is a real challenge, but the energy overall is a double challenge because the price of energy that we've seen, the surge on prices, it's mad. Electricity, and it doesn't really matter whether it's green electricity, which could be a bit cheaper, or it's fossil industry. I think the barrel is in between $90 or $100 at the moment, or whether it's even nuclear, which is very expensive. What you see but is worth noting is the rise of a human-centric building design, which is very important in the US, also very important in Japan. When I had the chance to visit a building a few years back, and I was waiting to visit the warehouse, and I was in something what looked like a restaurant. And I said, "Oh, that's funny, you have a restaurant." They said, "No, that's the breakout area. That's the canteen for our staff." But the look and feel is very, very high end. And, that is very important because finding labor is the key challenge we have across all the geographies. Thanks, Sven. You can. What is the impact and what could be the impact on the price of green buildings? So we see, and we are referencing 56% to say that we could yield a 10% higher price, rental premiums as well. And it sounds like people are starting to be able to pay a premium for more sustainable buildings, and very often principals or shippers or manufacturers or retailers who are not really willing to pay more for a sustainable operation and a greener operation. Now we found out in 2021 that this is starting to happen. Thank you, Sven. Then we have a section on design and digitization. So I touched on that earlier a little bit because it's all interlinked, in fact, and I'm trying to give you examples. Automation and robotics, and we see it in the 3PL world. The ones that are really gaining market share are the ones who are at the forefront of automation and robotics, especially when it comes to fulfillment centers. And it's happening primarily in Americas, but also in Europe to a certain degree. In Europe, what we notice is that there is a strong trend on the supply chain digitization, but we could debate what that is exactly. That would be for another time. And focus on environmental solution we've mentioned before. The reshoring and the nearshoring is really a trend in the US. Thank you, Sven. So looking forward, the outlook, we have about 65% of the respondents that think that smart technology is very important and would be even more important. We have a few design challenges around yard, for instance, more space, especially for people who do fulfillment centers, and as we move down the distribution chain for smaller buildings. Sustainability requirements, that's very big, especially in Europe. Technology, automation and robotics, again, we said that before. So that's looking forward. The trends are there to stay. That's the message here. I think we can move on to the next one, Sven. And of course, that's a breakdown of what type of technology would impact what region, and it's no secret or not very surprising that the technology will impact the countries that have got that are advanced in digital infrastructure. And we reference here Singapore, for instance, which is a key historical hub. And there are some areas that are, funny enough, there is Japan, which is an outlier, which very often has a tech flavor, but in terms of logistics, not so much. And China, I think it's because it's a very vast market that is trying to catch up, but the technology impact is not so important there. We can move on, Sven. Sorry, that was the last. We might have some questions. I can take some questions. As I said, this is derived from about 800 people we surveyed within JLL and a few dozens of clients we have, and we surveyed them in the different geographies. This is part of a program that we started last year, and we'll be running that every year for the next few years. And the interesting thing would be to present again and share the trends and see how this compares, especially for the outlook. Look, I can take a few questions. I don't know how this is planned.
Maybe I can step in, Guy. Thank you so much for the presentation. I think it's really interesting. You know, from our side, it's the first time or the second time actually we organize a webinar like this. So quite short, only one subject. Personally, I really like it. It's you know, people have had so many webinars, and just to give you know, a single topic presentation is a great concept. So what you mentioned, if you do this on a regular basis, this survey, it would for sure be something from HIDC side we would like to follow up in next sessions in the future. There's indeed a few, well, there's actually one question at the moment. So please, if anybody else has questions, please do not hesitate to ask it in the chat. If you want, of course, it can be in Dutch if that makes it a bit easier, but I'm sure most people will manage in English as well. So the question that's asked, actually from my former colleague, Juliette, nice to have you on the audience. So the question is, what is your view on the developments of logistics property versus the scarcity of square meters in the near future? It's of course a big issue in the Netherlands, but I'm sure it's in most other countries, it's the same thing going on. Could the scarce square meters be made beneficial for logistics? I guess it also has to do with like brownfield developments and you know what, my personal question was related to this, specifically if there's a tendency for smaller sites like the 5,000 square meters, what's of course much easier for a brownfield kind of structure than the mega warehouses. So what's your opinion on this?
So a few comments on that question. So number one, there will still be some land that is made available, but I think you have to approach it in a different way. You have to approach it in a way that the new logistics buildings and the large ones will be the factories of the past. And they will, as we notice here, they will take into account a human-centric dimension, meaning be mindful about the labor or the talent, depending how you want to call it, and people call it different way. But people still need to work. There are not that many manufacturing jobs left in Europe, especially not in France. And I think if you demonstrate to local authorities that you are investing, you are having you're investing in automation, for instance, you're having sustainable building, you're taking into account the human-centric approach, I think you can have access to land. What I will also say is that through COVID, what we have seen is there is a lot more investors' appetite in Europe and globally for this logistics asset class. And in places like London, smaller space buildings has got the same yield, which is the ratio in between rent and value of a property, as office. So as you see offices in city centers being taken down and redeveloped, I think you will see now that the price of logistics space has gone up. You will see more and more redevelopment. So these are the few ideas I can share with you, and that's my view on the matter.
Okay, well, you were mentioning price, and that's actually also related to the next question that was asked, but then that has mainly to do with the height of buildings. Of course, that's another solution for the square meter issue we have in most of Western European countries. So would higher buildings become an option, and what would be the consequences on rental prices? Like, you know.
So there are a few different types of, we call it multi-story buildings, that you can either access by ramps or you can have access from the inside. And instead of having horizontal conveying system, sorry, you have vertical conveyors. So there is that's one of the answers. We still have some people reluctant to use some multi-story. People tend to use, and one of them, there's no secret here, Amazon historically, when they first opened their fulfillment centers, they were not using all the cube. Okay, so they were going for very large buildings, but a lot of the cube was wasted. But now they have installed mezzanines everywhere, and they've moved on in terms of operations. So that's one of the answers. Yes, and with the automation and fulfillment centers, we see a lot of different type of automation. Some are more flexible than others. I think that that's one of the way forward. The price that possibly will drive the price of square meter up, but as you will put more products in the same, call it box, or in the same cubic, you will be better off. And to an earlier point that you raised, I think the rise in space cost is in fact an opportunity for the logistics service provider industry. It's an opportunity along with automation. It's an opportunity to be more tech savvy, to attract more talent that could be attracted by automation. So more people, because historically, and I'm well placed to say that, because I worked 25 years in logistics, we were like not the sector of choice. You know, all the engineers, they were not going to, you know, the graduates, they were not all going to logistics. So we have an opportunity in the same way as we see, I think it was GXO yesterday released their Q4 and their full year 2021 results. They have great results, you know, financial results. If you compare that, and you could draw a parallel with the shipping lines, Maersk has got great results, CMA, Hapag-Lloyd, everybody. So I think there's an opportunity, but from property prices going up, that could have a positive knock-on effect for the logistics service provider industry.
Yeah, I think that's a trend we also see. It's a big discussion in the Netherlands. Value added by logistics service providers, and indeed because of the nearshoring trend, prices going up, labor shortage. There's an opportunity for logistics companies to add value and to take on more activities that they might not have been doing in the past. And what you mentioned in like with the smaller sites, adding more value and having a more personalized setup, there's for sure large opportunities, but it might take a while before companies are really up to speed and realize that, you know, there's huge opportunities in this perspective. Okay, so we're running out of time. What I mentioned, our aim is really to keep it short and have webinars like this on a regular basis. So I'm going to close this webinar. Thank you, Sven, Guy, for the presentation. I think it was really useful, and for sure from HIDC side, I think we would like to get in touch and have a few more brainstorms on the things you just discussed. From HIDC sides, we have a few more events planned in the coming weeks. The first one will be March 15th. There will be a webinar on innovation, so most definitely highly interesting. And of course, we're really eager to start organizing live events again. Well, the first one that is, well, more or less sure will be the NDD, Nationale Distributiedag, what's going to take place July 6th in Lelystad. So hopefully we can meet all of you there, and hopefully we are also able to organize one or two more live events before that. So, well, that's all from me at this point in time. I would like to thank you all for joining the webinar, and looking forward to meet in person in the near future. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.